In our study, we also had tested drinking water, and one of our outcomes was that we didn't find any drinking water with Roundup in it. So we implied that it must have occurred from food sources, and indeed we have had some government agencies looking into residuals in food of glyphosate, and you can see some of these foods here, and it's a little frightening to think that some of my favorite foods could have up to 1,200 parts per billion of glyphosate in them. So the next step of our study was to collaborate with my friend and collaborator, Dr. Skinner, who has a mouse model that he's developed over many, many years to test whether a pregnant rat exposed to a little tiny bit of glyphosate should have any abnormal consequences. The difference between the rat model and the human model is that in 3 years, he can actually test 3 generations of rats. He can look at the babies, the mid-size and adults, and ask, does a glyphosate exposure in the first pregnancy have consequences to its descendants? And so he exposed just for 7 days the pregnant mouse, pregnant rat, and got this data. I will point out from this slide that when a fetus inside the mother is exposed, when the mother drinks glyphosate, it isn't just the fetus that's exposed, but it's also the fetus's fetus that's inside of him. So in other words, this baby has either sperm or egg gametes, and those are also directly exposed to the pesticide that mother got exposed to. So in one fell swoop, we can get 3 generations affected. Dr. Skinner is especially interested, though, in what happens in the 3rd generation, the generation that wasn't exposed, didn't exist when the pregnancy occurred. And what he has demonstrated is that the 3rd generation can only have acquired disease or problems if there's some DNA, some epigenetic consequence that has changed and been transmitted through sperm and egg. And I'm sorry to report that he has found with glyphosate that such consequences occur. And I'll just explain this to you a little bit. If this is a piece of DNA here, during exposures to chemicals, DNA can be altered, and it won't be shown up as a genetic problem, but what we call an epigenetic problem, where the carbon atom attaches to the cytosine molecule and interferes with the way that gene is transcribed. He's found that pesticides and other chemicals all can cause changes in DNA methylation across the genome, and that these correlate with changes in gene expression. This is a control animal, an enclosaline exposed animal, and you can see just by the color change that there's been a dramatic change in thousands of genes and how well they're expressed. And so when he looks at the impact of glyphosate exposure in pregnant mothers, he sees 2 generations later in F2 and F3 obesity in both males and females. This is probably the most dramatic finding because as it turns out, the US is in the midst of an epidemic of obesity, which, as you've all been told, is caused by poor parenting, bad food choices, and TV. And unfortunately, the answer is possibly directly related to what farmers are putting on their fields. Another example is ovarian disease. Polycystic ovaries occurred in both 2nd and 3rd generation rats. And so what I'm doing in the next series of slides is I'm showing you what is happening in humans over this time period. PCOS rates are going sky high in the US. Kidney disease is incredibly more likely in the 3rd generation descendants of glyphosate exposed rats, and it's on the rise in the US. Cancer rates in mice are increased, and we've all puzzled over why cancer rates are going up in the US. And from this slide, you can see that cancer rates aren't equally distributed in the US. In fact, Iowa and Indiana do pretty poorly in the cancer rates department, and that's because we have higher croplands. And this is a childhood cancer rate, which also shows that the cancer rate for a child is more associated with how close she lives to croplands and so on. Another finding that's really of importance to the clinicians is that multiple diseases are now becoming more common. It's not that you just have hypertension, that you're also obese and you have diabetes. These, in fact, were found to be transmitted to the third generation offspring of glyphosate-exposed great-grandmothers. And we can see that that's exactly what's happening in adults and in humans. In fact, this trifecta of obesity, hypertension, and diabetes by itself has a tremendous impact on other health issues. Just one example is that these conditions, diabetic conditions, increase the risk of a child being autistic by 60 to 70%. And as you all probably know, autism rates are increasing in prevalence and also in early onset. As a little bit of a digression, we have other evidence, epidemiological evidence, that glyphosate was the leading pesticide to be correlated. This is prenatal pesticide exposure in pregnant women in the US with the risk of basically autism spectrum disorders. This has now been confirmed in animals where pesticide, glyphosate exposed rats produce offspring with symptoms that are autism-like. And in fact, we found that they're exposed, these exposed pregnant rats have an altered genome or altered expression of their the bacteria in their gut. And we didn't realize the extent to which the bacteria in our gut modify the way our brain works. This has led up to the final discovery that if you take the autistic kids today and give them feces from a healthy child by way of pills, that their symptoms decrease. And this is a really important concept for us overall to discover how many ways a pesticide can hurt you. The final slide here is on parturition problems. Mike Skinner discovered that babies, the products of babies and the pregnancies of mothers F2 and F3 were more likely to suffer maternal mortality rates. And those of you who've been keeping tabs on the public health outcomes in pregnant women in the US have noticed perhaps that the US is one of the only developed countries in which maternal mortality rates have been rising. And we are very aware of this in the hospital, in the bedside, but everyone's wondering why. Well, to reemphasize this, we can see that smaller birth weight can translate into obesity, and that renal disease increases, parturition problems increase. Puberty is also altered, and I wanted to bring that up. PCOS rates are higher. Testicular disease is higher. Testicular disease translates into poor quality sperm, and I'll show you what that means. Prostate disease could very well correlate with the fact that every descendant of my grandfather who used pesticides on his sheep have had prostate cancer. And average age of puberty is being altered by these chemicals, as well as kidney disease. Dr. Skinner and I also collaborated on an atrazine study. Atrazine is the second leading herbicide used in the US and is found in every stream, river, and measured. It produces, among other conditions, testicular disease, changes in puberty, changes in body type, an increase in multiple diseases, and some emotional issues. And this is kind of what that looks like. And I want to emphasize that the worldwide, some of us in the world are very concerned that sperm quality has been declining steadily in the world, and especially in the US. And that decline, if it continues, may have dire consequences to the population, such that one of my colleagues, Shana Swan, has just published this book. I'll recommend it to you, which suggests that the biggest consequence of these chemicals may be in the human race is on a very rapid decline in fertility. I also want to point out that puberty onset is a big deal. It's a concept that's hard to understand, but we've suffered a dramatic decline in onset of puberty, such that more and more 10-year-old girls are starting their menstrual periods, and that in the United Kingdom, the onset of puberty as a measure of a health condition has been linked to every single adverse adult chronic disease that they measure. That means that what I'm saying then is late or early onset puberty by itself can be used as a major risk factor for a lifetime risk of subsequent diseases. And if you don't find your disease on this list, it probably isn't important. Every one of the chronic diseases that we are seeing, all of these we've become concerned about. Why does everybody have irritable bowel? Why has everybody got food allergies? Why rheumatoid arthritis and gout? And all of this could ultimately be explained by epigenetic mechanisms that derive from multi-generational, transgenerational epigenetic disease. So I want to just sort of slide that would sort of, this makes me think of Iowa for some reason, but this is a celebrated great grandmother who ultimately could be associated with 148 descendants before she passed away. But from my perspective, a pregnant mother, this mother, if contaminated by us, could account for that many other people's impacts. And I'll just simply say that we're not measuring this in our current public health approach, our EPA regulatory approach. We haven't taken care of this problem. We have become saturated on this globe with man-made chemicals that are government approved. And if we fail to act on this, we could very well be on a declining health pattern that has a natural end. It's in all our food, it's in all our animals, it's in all our pregnant mothers. And this is an example of how many chemicals now all pregnant mothers have inside of them, including the one we just added. Or we could change. So that's the overview.
Thank you, Dr. Winchester. There are a few questions that came through. You gave us so much information here and we have a little bit of time to unpack it before we move on to Paul's presentation. The first question that we had that came through was from Anne, I believe Ann Parker, and I'm looking for the question here. Yes, Ann Parker. She was curious about some of the charts that you showed at the very beginning of your presentation, looking at the peaks. And she wanted clarification. Are these peaks in Iowa? Are they national? Maybe they were only in Indiana. Maybe you could give us a little bit more information about those.
Sure. These are all good questions, and feel free to. It turns out that the U.S. Geological Survey provided me with data from the entire U.S. Their study is called the NAQUA study, the National Area Water Quality Study. And even though northern climates apply pesticides slightly later than southern climates, the pesticide peak tended to be, this is a U.S. peak, if you will. This one shows atrazine, but you can sum all the pesticides together and get the same shape. So Iowa is on that NAQUA study, so is Indiana, but we use the entire NAQUA study data set to create these. It's a good point, because our quest for understanding what was causing peaks and troughs in pesticides in preterm birth had to create a environmental signature that everyone shared. And we couldn't use the chrome industrial plant downstream from where you live, or the you know, whatever polluting factory might be upstream from you. But water tends to be the same across the U.S. Obviously, there are differences in rates of application, and we did that in the California study, where it's unfortunate that California is one of the only states that requires documentation of pesticide application per county. And so we divided low, medium, and high counties by their pesticide use. And what's astounding is that you can do that in a very large state like California and produce 3 separate curves for how long you're likely to stay pregnant and how much premature birth likelihood you have. And that's what makes these correlations over many studies in many counties compelling. There's something going on. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Another question.
Yes, thank you for that disambiguation, that sort of teasing apart. There are a lot of variables at play here when you're thinking about environmental toxic exposure, but I think you do a good job of explaining how we can sort of narrow this down to pesticides here. So Emily has a question about some of the epigenetic impacts that we're seeing. She's curious, is the same 3-generation impact trend when we're seen in pregnant mothers, I think with those rat studies that you mentioned? So is that 3-generation impact trend seen when pregnant mothers are exposed to other types of pesticides as well, or is it a glyphosate specific trend?
Well, whenever you take a problem into the lab, you try to control for all the other variables. Well, that's actually been a conundrum for us for almost all the time we've been trying to study this, because there isn't anyone that isn't also exposed to 1,000 other things. And the best way to do that is to take an animal model. You know that rat model, if you tested that rat for other chemicals, you'd probably find them. But if all of the rats share sort of a background of exposures, and the only thing you allow is a change in whether they got glyphosate or not, then the changes between the two groups, which are otherwise identical, has to derive from that one exposure that you added. Now, for pregnant mothers, we're in the same conundrum. We can't really run them through the 3-generation rat model that Dr. Skinner can do, but we can ask if we measure one contaminant in your urine, and we see that the changes in that concentration change the risk of outcomes, that it's a correlation, but nevertheless one that in the rat model shows you how it might be true. So the rat model is one in which you've manipulated the variable and you find an outcome related to that variable, which has to be related to what you did in the experiment. In the human model, we're still swimming upstream, if you will, because we don't have the privilege of asking a mother, would you like to take the low dose of pesticides or the high dose for this next experiment? And one of the important concepts here is that we can't wait to do nothing. To me, the message we should be giving to industry is not that I have to prove that it's harmful to people before they can use it. I think they need to prove that it's safe to people before they can use it, and certainly before they can expose all of us to it without even testing whether it's in us. That's my biggest, if you will, complaint about what we've done so far. All of us are public health advocates, I assume, that we're talking to. Every one of us, whether we live on the farm like I did, or whether we're taking care of babies like Pete does, but we are all products of this same environment that we're in. And what I'm exposing here to some extent is a very serious outcome that is not even being measured at present time by our government agencies that oversee and protect us.
I think you raise a really, really important point that I sort of want to emphasize here, that there seems to be this mismatched burden of proof, right? You put it really quite well, that the emphasis really is, it's not, the burden of proof seems to be backwards, right? It should be that industry should prove that these products are safe, instead of maybe folks who are dealing with these very long-term latent health issues to try to prove that they're being harmed by some of these unmeasured, untested chemicals in our environment. And I did have a follow-up question on the F1 through 3 generation rat study. Maybe you know, maybe you don't, but were these environmentally relevant exposures of glyphosate? Do you know?
Yes, and that's a really important question, because one of the complaints that people point at Skinner's model is that he's not trying to do an experiment of the natural kind. Now, what he did take was a dose of glyphosate, which is 50% of what is considered the lowest level that could be lethal. It's actually, the lowest level that could have detectable effects based on the EPA data. So it's a very low dose. And it's also not given throughout the pregnancy. It's only given in the first week of the pregnancy. Now, to do the study that would say this is an environmentally relevant level and this is the dose response curve for F1, F2, would cost him 4 times the amount just to do that study, which he'd be glad to do if someone were able to fund it. This 3 generation model by itself is $500,000. It's extremely expensive. And so that's part of the problem is, would it not be worth the human race's time and money to ask the EPA to insist that these pesticides, the new chemicals that are approved for use, at least go through this study? They're not doing that at the present time, but those are the reasons they're not. So when you hear a complaint that says this is not environmentally relevant, and therefore it's not useful, or that epidemiology itself is not useful, which in the last administration, EPA tried to ban epidemiology studies altogether. I don't know if you know that, but that's the kind of conundrum we're in. We have to ask ourselves, if you're not going to ask the questions, then you're going to not be happy with the answers.
I have one final point that I'm hoping that maybe you can tease apart for us, Dr. Winchester, and that is, the hormonally active component of some of these pesticides. I noticed that you list atrazine peaks in some of your graphs there, and that's well understood to be an endocrine disruptive chemical or hormonally active chemical, and I think some of the latent or long-term health effects, the ones that sort of follow very early life exposure, follow that child into adulthood and sort of seeing all of these metabolic diseases later in life. I know that some of the research has shown that some of these metabolic conditions are attributed or related to endocrine disrupting chemicals. And we know that a lot of these pesticides, atrazine of course included, glyphosate included, are hormonally active. So I wanted to give you a little bit of space to maybe talk about this aspect.
Well, you're a mind reader, Audrey. So the study that Skinner began was based on the concept of endocrine disruption. In fact, he still uses that expression. He chose his first chemical that he tested well before he tested glyphosate was vinclozolene, which is a fungicide used on the grapes of the Napa Valley. He chose it for that very reason, because we already know that extremely low doses of endocrine disruptors can alter many things in the offspring. In fact, one of my collaborators at Berkeley showed that atrazine can turn male frogs into hermaphrodites or reproductive females just through endocrine disruption mechanisms. So we have not taken endocrine disruption off the table in these studies, but what Skinner has shown is that beyond that, there's something dramatic that occurs, which I like to use the word, if you would allow me to use it, not endocrine disruption, but epigenetic disruption. And I'm not sure that you have to be an endocrine disruptor to be an epigenetic disruptor. And I think in many ways we should probably get epigenetic disruption as the term we use to explain transgenerational inheritance of disease. And but the other theme in my presentation is that every time every decade, we seem to go through a discovery of yet one more way in which pesticides can harm us. And I briefly brought that to your attention through the disruption of the microbiome, the disruption of our gut flora. That wasn't something we thought of as a way to harm us. It's certainly not being tested as a regulatory consideration. It was thought that glyphosate, since it disrupts a biochemical pathway that humans don't have, how could it possibly hurt us? Except it does hurt the several billion microbiomes that we depend on in our gut. And when it does disrupt it, you can create literally disease from it and cure it. So it just reminds you that the target of a chemical that you're applying in the billions of tons per year that ends up in your body could be doing a lot more than you think.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Winchester. And that's a really important, I think, distinction, or something at least to think about that I hadn't heard of before. Endocrine disruption versus maybe epigenetic disruption. That's very interesting. I think I'll keep thinking about that. I want to move on to our next panelist now and give you a little bit of a break, Dr. Winchester, before we bring you back in for the question and answer at the end. But we're going to move on to Paul Muggy, who is a local to Iowa organic farmer out in Sutherland, Iowa. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Paul. And I think, Dr. Winchester, you may need to stop sharing your screen in order to give Paul the reins.
Yes, I do. Or
Okay.
We can see that, Paul.
Okay, are we good to go?
We're great.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Winchester. That was scary, frankly. It's a tough act to follow. Hopefully I can be a little bit more positive that there is hope out here. Again, I am Paul Muggy. I live in far northwest Iowa. I've been farming since 1976 and completely organic for the last 20 years. I just have a small farm of 300 acres. I have a wife, 3 kids, and 7 grandkids. And I'll skip this. This just shows the use of pesticides that Dr. Winchester has already shown. I can't get that out of the way.
We can see your slides perfectly fine, though.
Yeah, I just can't read them because I've got my picture in the way. Organic agriculture, on the other hand, as opposed to industrial agriculture, is a system that sustains the health of soils, ecosystems, and people, relies on ecological processes, biodiversity, and cycles adapted to local conditions, rather than the use of inputs and adverse effects. So in terms of pesticides in food, it's kind of a no-brainer because organic agriculture does not allow the use of any pesticides. So that's not to say that we're going to have zero residues, because you get some in rainwater and things like that, but the residues should be drastically less. And I understand that the labels, there are many labels out there that can be confusing, but if you see this label, you can be sure that the food that's associated with this label was produced without prohibited substances. So I'm just going to go through my farm just really briefly. First, why I became organic a long time ago, mainly because industrial agriculture is unsustainable. And from all of these reasons, human health included, for me, mainly, at least initially, it was for environmental and ecological reasons. Because if you look at all of our environmental problems, with the possible exception of radioactive waste, they all have a basis in agriculture. And I think that organic agriculture, and I try and farm the way that will help alleviate or mitigate some of these issues. Organic agriculture presents a growing opportunity to mitigate climate change while creating economic, environmental, and health benefits for all food system participants. And the emphasis there is mine. It's not just benefiting the farmers, it's benefiting all consumers, and it's benefiting the environment as a whole. So how do I farm organically? It all sort of begins with a rotation. My rotation is corn, soybeans, and a small grain. And the small grain kind of depends on what the market demands. My first choice is fall triticale, which is in this picture. The corn is, yes,
would
ma'am.
I be able to introduce, just interrupt really quickly? I'm curious if you could explain what a rotation is for this audience if they're not familiar.
Okay, most industrial agriculture in Iowa, and I'm sure in Indiana too, is just a corn soybean rotation where you have corn one year, soybeans the next year, and then you're back to corn the following year. Organic agriculture introduces more crops. In my case, I have 3 crops, so I'm not back to corn, for example, until the 3rd year. And that enables many ecological processes to eliminate some of the pest problems that we would otherwise have. So my corn is the only place in the rotation that I actually have to do full width tillage. I plant a normal population. I plant it relatively late compared to other farmers. I use a lot of mechanical means of controlling weeds. And it mostly works. There are a few times, you need a little help from Mother Nature now and again, but it usually works pretty well. As far as soybeans, they're planted with a ridge till system that you may not be familiar with. If you look at this slide, the 6 rows on the left have been planted to soybeans following the corn. The rest of the field has not yet been planted. So the first trip over the field is with the planter, and the planter scrapes an inch or 2 of soil off the top of that ridge where the old corn row was, and then plants the soybeans right in that row. And it's an excellent system as far as resource conservation, and it's a great way to raise organic soybeans. This is what it looks right after planting. It looks kind of black in the top pictures, but all of that corn residue is still there. I like this slide. These soybeans have been cultivated once. They have not yet been walked. They will be, but you can see that all of that corn residue is still there, and it's protecting the soil. Soybeans, again, ridge tilled early May. I plant a fairly high population. Again, mechanical weed control and walk the beans. The small grain follows soybeans. The fall triticale is drilled in early October. It's no-till drilled right behind the combine. So, and then there will be no other tillage until 15 months later. And you can see in the picture on the right, the green underneath that triticale is red clover. And that's part of the way that I get my fertility for my corn and soybeans. I get probably 80 to 100 pounds of nitrogen from that red clover, but I also get some weed control. I get an incredible amount of biomass and ground cover. I get habitat for beneficial insects when it's flowering, some allelopathy. There are many benefits to that. I also have a really good deal. I have a neighbor that has a cow-calf herd, and I give him my straw from my small grains, and he uses it for bedding and some for feed. And at the end of the day, he gives me back the manure and compost, and I have a compost turner, so I make pretty good compost, and that's the way I get the fertility for my crops. So how do I control pests without being able to use pesticides? And I try and use some of Mother Nature's methods, the free ecosystem services. This picture is regarding allelopathy, which is one of those methods. And the picture on the right, or the right half of the picture, is fall triticale, and on the left is flax. And these rows are north and south, so this is not a light effect. But allelopathy is the capability of some plants to exude chemicals through their roots that inhibit the germination and early growth of other plants. In this case, the triticale is inhibiting the growth of the flax. There's actually another row of flax right next to the triticale that is, you can't even see it. So I try and use this to help me control weeds. Another thing is seed predation. This is some work from Matt Liebman at Iowa State. And it turns out that if you leave weed seeds on the soil surface for a period of time, most of them get eaten by something. And in this particular graph, the horizontal axis is the months after seed dispersal, and the vertical axis is the percent of those weed seeds that are eaten. And in my case, for example, with the ridge-tilled soybeans, those weed seeds are on the surface for 6 or 7 months. So 70% of them are eaten by something like field crickets and carabid beetles. Field mice eat a lot. They're active during the winter underneath the snow. But the secret is you can't do any fall tillage because the seeds need to stay on the soil surface. And you need to provide a little bit of habitat for them when they're not out in the field. In a lab, one female cricket ate 223 pigweed seeds in one day. So 90% of these seeds can be destroyed by the end of the year. But again, you must not disturb them and you must provide habitat. So to that end, I have some prairie strips in my fields. I have a beetle bank alongside each one of them that has specific plants that provide habitat for these little creatures during the off season. And these strips provide many other benefits at the same time. They provide biodiversity, pollinator habitat, they provide habitat for other beneficial insects, and they provide a lot of resource conservation with soil erosion and things like that. So as far as insects, pests go, monocultures tend to encourage pests. And if you have a corn and soybean rotation, that's pretty close to a monoculture in that you have 2 summer annual row crops in rotation. And in 1945, 7% of the world's crops were lost to insects. And 50 years later, after millions and millions and millions of pounds of insecticides, we lost 14% of the world's crops to insects. So we're winning a battle now and again, but we're losing the war. And insects develop resistance to pesticides. And when you're spraying insecticides, you're killing beneficial insects too. As far as diseases go, the sudden death syndrome in soybeans is a serious disease for conventional soybean farmers. The blue bar is a 2-year rotation, which would be typical of most of Iowa and Indiana. It's corn and soybeans. And the red bar is a longer rotation, not even necessarily an organic rotation, but it allows Mother Nature to do its thing. And you can see that sudden death syndrome is not really an issue when you have a longer rotation, and you just can't even really find sudden death syndrome on organic farms. Another example as far as insects go, this is from Indonesia, where apparently they raise a lot of rice, which is very chemically intensive. They had, I think it was 27 different chemicals that were approved for application in their rice fields. And at one point, the Indonesian government, at the insistence of a Hindu priest, said, okay, this is enough. We're not going to do this anymore. They banned 26 of those 27 chemicals, and the other chemical was severely restricted when it could be used. So they went from 4.5 applications per year down to 1/2 an application per year. The cost to the farmer declined by about 2/3, cost to the government declined by 90%. And traditional wisdom would say, this is going to be a train wreck. but the yields actually went up because they were allowing free ecosystem services. They weren't killing the good guy insects anymore. So does organic yield less? And this criticism is leveled quite a bit against organic, and the argument goes that if organic agricultural yields are lower, then you, in order to feed the burgeoning world population, you need to use more land, and that additional land is probably going to be more marginal. So it's more subject to erosion and salinization and desertification, and you're going to end up with more environmental damage than if you were organic. But according to the ISU, the long-term ecological study, and also the Rodale Farming Systems trial, they're two 30-year comparisons of organic with conventional. The yields are pretty similar, and you see that in a lot of other research. Ecosystem services instead of synthetic inputs is the key to achieving food security. So regenerative agriculture absolutely can feed the world. In fact, some would say it's the only way you can feed the world. And it can do it while stabilizing climate, regenerating ecosystems, restoring biodiversity, and enhancing rural communities. But some would say, yeah, but you are doing so much tillage for mechanical weed control. You're making so many trips over the field and burning diesel fuel, and you're just destroying our climate. But according to David Pimentel, who's at Cornell University, the two bars on the left are organic systems, and the one on right is conventional. And organic systems tend to use about 2/3 the amount of fossil fuel energy per acre of industrial agriculture systems. And the reason for that, almost exclusively, is for fertilizer. The anhydrous ammonia, nitrogen fertilizer, is horrendously energy intensive. And many other researchers have found this same thing. Also, I have a solar PV array that provides all of the electricity for my home and my farm. So I'm not buying a lot of electricity.
About 2 more minutes, Paul.
Oh, okay. These are just some, I guess, pictures of the strips and how they can help stabilize soil. And not only that, they're beautiful. So this was a systematic review, meta-analysis of 343 peer-reviewed publications indicate that organic crops and foods have statistically higher concentrations of antioxidants. And there's a reason for that. These are chemicals, phytochemicals, that the plants produce as a response to challenges from diseases and insects. And if you're out there spraying every time you see an insect, the plants are going to produce those chemicals. And these are the things that keep us healthy. I'm going to skip that. Dr. Winchester talked about that a lot. I just want to end with this. This is from Dr. Ratan Lal of Ohio State University. He said, when people are poverty-stricken and starving, they pass on their suffering to the land. And that is thought-provoking, but I think it's equally true and perhaps more poignant if you turn it around. If the land is stricken, if it's eroded or overtilled or overgrazed or nearly devoid of life, then it passes its suffering on to the people who depend on it for their sustenance. On any given day, there are 71 million people displaced from their homes in the world. And certainly many of those are fleeing persecution and violence, but many are climate refugees. They're fleeing degraded soils that are no longer able to support them. And their numbers will increase. And I think organic agriculture may have a part to play in helping to relieve some of that suffering, both for the land and for its people. So I end back where I started. This is what it's all about. I hope to pass my farm on to the next generation in better condition than when I began my tenure. And I would love to have your questions when we get to the Q&A at the end. And also, I guess, I don't think I mentioned before, to invite anybody that wants to visit my farm. You're welcome here anytime. So thank you.
What a wonderful offer.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Paul. This was just absolutely fantastic. I do have two very quick, one very quick clarifying question about the differences between prairie strips and beetle banks. Could you give us a definition of a beetle bank? I know you said it's like sort of houses those beneficial insects, but can you tell us a little bit more about the differences between the two?
Yes, it's mostly a matter of which plants are there. I have a strip along the side of each one of the strips where you have bunch grasses, and I also have the soil bermed up a little bit where it's drier, just because those plants provide better habitat for those insects. So there's nothing magical about it. I'm just trying to provide habitat for them. And I know Andy has some beetle banks too that he'll probably talk about.
That's right. Wonderful. There was a question about fertilizer that I wanted to clarify for the folks who are, one, not in agriculture themselves, and two, maybe the rules of organic agriculture are a little shaky. But so you use manure and not a synthetic fertilizer, synthetic nitrogen. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And
okay.
The rules aren't really shaky at all. I'm just not allowed to use those things. There are some things that are permitted, things that are just mined from the ground. And I can use lime, for example, to alter pH in the soil. But basically, I can't use any of the things that conventional farmers use. So I rely on manure and legume crops to provide the fertilizer that I need. And I've done this for 20 years, and I really haven't had to add anything. I take soil tests, and things are working pretty well. I have not even had to lime in those 20 years.
Great, thank you, Paul. A good thing to know. I don't think a lot of people know that you can't use synthetic nitrogen on certified organic crops. So thank you for that.
Yeah, right. 1% of all the fossil fuel energy in the world is used to make anhydrous ammonia.
I was looking at the graph that the study you showed about fossil fuel use for conventional versus organic, and Dr. Matt Liebman and I'm sure she's a doctor as well, Dr. Madeline Hunt at the University of Minnesota, right, have done a really cool sort of updated and just continuing to confirm what previous studies have shown when it comes to environmental impacts, ecological and sustainable impacts of farming. So with that, I will save some of the rest of those questions for the group Q&A at the end that maybe you and Andy can tackle at the end as farmers. But I'm going to pass it over to Andy now so that he can describe his farming practices. Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Audrey. Can you hear me okay, Audrey? All right. I'm going to do my share screen thing here. And everybody see that okay?
Yes.
So my name is Andy Dunham, and I have farmed with my wife Melissa here at Grinnell Heritage Farm since 2006, and we've been certified organic by MOSA, which is the Midwest Organic Services Association. And so, like Paul, we're using a lot of the same principles and practices, approaching farming from the standpoint of it being a system as opposed to trying to impose our will. Before my beard went gray. And I always like to say, so we raise vegetables here, or have raised vegetables here, and we are what we eat eats. So and this is an aerial shot of the farm. We want to leave it better, like Paul said. Here's directly above. So this is a very different landscape than many of the corn soy. And I'll go so far as to say that corn soy is not a rotation, that's an alternation. And so if you're gonna call it a rotation, you have to have more than 2 points, because it's really hard to rotate a segment and have it actually roll. And so on our fields, we raised fruit and nut crops, and we had at one point up to 25 acres of certified organic produce. Raised 500,000 transplants and set them out, and we served like the Cedar Valley all the way over to Des Moines. And we actually shipped an awful lot of food through Whole Foods to Indiana, Dr. Winchester. So If you were shopping at Whole Foods in Indianapolis, you were certainly eating my kale at one point in time. I'm going to take it in a little bit different direction because I knew what Dr. Winchester was going to talk about, and I knew what Paul was going to talk about farming-wise. So Iowa agriculture is disproportionately responsible for many of the ill effects that we see within the Mississippi River watershed. So water quality, whether it be from confinement feeding operations, pesticides, fertilizers running into the Gulf of Mexico and contributing to the dead zone. Iowa is the largest producer of confinement hogs in the country. And so we actually have enough hogs that are producing waste material that is stored in pits underneath these confinement operations that the state of Iowa has as much effluent that we have to deal with as the entire country of Bangladesh. And they have a population, I think, of like 160 million people or something like that. And in Iowa, if you're not aware of how those are regulated, the Department of Natural Resources has a master matrix, and you only have to score 50% on that master matrix in order to put in a confined animal feeding operation. I've never been in a class where 50% was a passing grade. But in Iowa, if you're wanting to store very, very polluting manure underground, it's a passing grade. Dr. Winchester touched upon that pesticides are, almost all of them are endocrine disruptors. And he talked about some of the EPA regulations and how really they aren't studying what we should be studying. But I do want to emphasize, and he kind of said it too, industrialized agriculture does mean that it's chemical agriculture. In Iowa, a lot of our corn goes into the corn ethanol industry. Almost all of the byproduct that comes out of that is fed to confined animals, whether they be beef cattle or poultry or hogs. And then ultimately we end up eating those livestock. One of the downsides to that is a lot of that, the quality of that feed stock that's coming out of ethanol plants is of very low quality. And the process actually helps to concentrate fungal toxins such as aflatoxins, vomitoxins, and T2 toxins, which are some of the most toxic natural substances known to humankind. And so, for example, in breeding sow units now, an acceptable death loss in a breeding sow unit is about 10 to 12% per year. So that means that if you have 1,000, breeding sows on your farm, you fully expect 10 to 12% of them, so 100 to 120 of them, to drop dead in their crate every single year. If you went back to my grandfather's generation, and if they would have had death losses like that, their banker would have forced them to stop raising pigs. And now we just call it the cost of doing business. What I'd like to focus on kind of going forward, though, is poor diets. I'm a vegetable farmer, and selling vegetables in Iowa, organic or non, can be kind of a tough sell. The commodities that we've kind of talked about so far, corn and soybeans, are almost entirely consumed as processed foods. So think high fructose corn syrup, or the ethanol byproduct being passed through, your pork chop, something like that. In the United States, we do not grow or import anywhere near enough fresh fruits and vegetables to meet the basic requirements of the My Plate, the USDA guidelines for what should be consumed. And we end up throwing into the landfill mostly almost a third of the total that we do grow or import. And so I think the latest data that I've seen is that over the last 5 to 10 years, the total consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables has fallen at an additional 10% from where it was. And we're only actually consuming somewhere in the 40% of what's recommended on the My Plate or the old food pyramid guidelines. In the fresh fruits and vegetables sector as well, we're focused entirely on yield for the most part with conventional breeding practices, not nutritional content. So if you look at, say, oranges, for example, there have been some studies out there that are showing that the vitamin content has fallen by 50%, or in broccoli, the vitamin content might have fallen by 40 to 50% since World War II. And a lot of that has to do not only with the chemical intensive nature of our farming practices, it's also the breeding. We've gone entirely for look, shelf life, and for consistency as opposed to nutritional content. And then the other thing about poor diets, Dr. Winchester touched a little bit upon it, using glyphosate or Roundup at harvest time on small grains. It is used as a desiccating agent, so farmers will spray that on wheat or barley or the triticale or something like that in order to improve the amount of grain that is harvested. So grain doesn't necessarily ripen all at the same time. And so when you go through with a combine, some of that will go right out the back end. So some of the grain will stay attached to the stalk and will pass through the combine. If you spray it 3 to 5 days prior to harvest, much more of that grain will actually be threshed out in the machine. And so you actually boost your yield by enough to cover the cost of paying to spray it. But the downside to that is that the way in which glyphosate works is that it goes to actively growing plant tissues or meristematic tissues. And at the time of harvest, the only meristematic tissue that is active in a plant is right at the seed, which is what we're consuming. So we actually are spraying the glyphosate on our seed to get a better yield, and then giving ourselves an extra big dose of glyphosate. So how can you make impact? We need in the United States, in addition to getting the EPA to do things, we need to encourage food literacy. I served in the Peace Corps, and I've been to, I think, 30 or 32 different countries. And the United States is by far the least food educated country I have ever traveled in. We would regularly, for example, at farmers markets, have people come up and pick up a bunch of Swiss chard and talk about how beautiful my rhubarb was. And that happened pretty much every farmers market I went to for 15 years. So we need to encourage food literacy. We need to build a food literate culture. And so one of the things that's really hurting us are our public education school lunch meals. My daughters, which go to school here in Grinnell, have anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes to eat, which is not anywhere near enough time. And so they actually would ask us if we packed lunch to not put in things like raw carrots because they don't actually have the time to chew them. We cannot expect people to be food literate and or care about food if we don't even give them the time to eat that food in school. I'd also like to see more transparency in agricultural systems, so no ag-gag laws. If there's a farm group that's promoting what they're calling ag-gag laws, so you can't have somebody go in and take video undercover, they're saying that they'll take it out of context. If you can't provide the context, you're probably doing something you shouldn't be doing. So I don't think that should be something we should promote. We do need to eliminate the routine use of antibiotics in livestock. If we're talking about, we're just hopefully coming out of the COVID pandemic. Some of the next pandemics very well could come out of these confined animal feeding operations or CAFOs. And glyphosate, the Roundup is actually the most widely used antibiotic in the world. It's a broad spectrum antibiotic and really does knock out bacterial populations, both in your gut and in the soil. We need to incentivize farming actions that measurably improve public health. So if we're sequestering carbon or reducing soil erosion or nitrate leaching into the Gulf of Mexico, farmers should be paid for those ecosystem services, not the agribusiness companies that are going to try to steal that money from farmers. And we need to support these systems thinking approaches, like what Paul was talking about. Can we grow oats that would be food grade here in Iowa? Can we find some of these approaches that will enable us to extend our rotation and have a real rotation? And that's where we should be throwing research dollars. I'm going to show you some photos of our farm, just to show you that it doesn't have to be a corn soybean alternation. We used to grow wholesale green and colored bell peppers and ship those to Indiana as well. So that's like an acre of peppers. We grew a lot of leafy greens and kale. These are some of the most nutrient-dense foods out there. I don't really like the term superfood because really you should be eating a varied diet. If you just ate kale, you'd be very unhealthy. Just like if you just ate ice cream, you'd be unhealthy. Maybe in a different way, you'd be unhealthy. We used to grow an awful lot of different things. This is what our farm stand would look like on a regular basis. We raised a lot, fruits and small vegetables. Beets are one of those things that are also very nutrient dense. And when you grow them in good quality in good healthy soil, you really don't need any inputs. Like what Paul was saying, we didn't need a lot of fertilizer. We composted on our farm. That provided as much nitrogen as we needed. And pests really, usually that was a management error. Either I didn't cultivate properly and I had some weed pressure, or I didn't irrigate when I needed to, or we had too much moisture. Pest problems tend to be management problems. And so in the conventional corn and soybean system, they're raising crops in sterilized dirt, more or less, because they're putting glyphosate out there and off any beneficial microorganisms that could possibly be in the soil, they're bound to have problems. It's just baked into their system. We used to do a lot of CSA shares. This is an example of a CSA share we'd have shipped out in early spring. It's mostly just to show the diversity. And that's kind of what our landscape looked like. Paul said we had a beetle bank, the tall bunch grasses in the background there with a tall rye cover crop behind it. That was one of our beetle banks. And the idea behind that is that there are certain native predatory ground nesting beetles that have very specific habitat requirements. And maybe you've seen them in your yard, but they're like, there's an 1.5 inch long beetle with great big pinchers that go side to side on it. And it's very wonderfully named the big-headed black beetle. That's the non-scientific name. And after we put these in, we would catch those quite regularly in our basement and in our mouse traps. So it's kind of like the Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you provide beneficial insect habitat on your farm, you will get beneficial insect help in your fields. Cover cropping is one of those things that tends to be kind of a buzzword that you hear about, and it is a way to build soil fertility. It's also a way, like what Paul said, to use allelopathic effects in order to help suppress weeds. And winter rye is great at doing that. Way off in the distance, you see what looks like dead corn. We raised a lot of sorghum Sudan grass on our farm. And that was one of the ways that we could really increase soil organic carbon values in a very short amount of time, because it has a very large root system, especially if you end up pruning off the top at about when it gets to be about chest high. You go in and you mow it off, and then that plant puts a tremendous amount of carbon into the soil. It grows its roots in response to that pruning effect, and you can actually raise your soil organic carbon values by almost 2,000 pounds per acre per year, which is pretty significant. We raised organic asparagus, or still have organic asparagus, for years and years, and we didn't have to use any herbicide. We ended up putting a cover crop of soybeans into it, and the soybeans would act to smother out. We'd plant a really high rate, and the soybeans would actually smother out the weeds, and then the asparagus ferns would grow up above the soybeans, and we really had a nice weed-free soybean field, or weed-free asparagus field. There's a picture of the beetle bank, kind of in its full glory with a field of carrots. We were known for growing carrots for a number of years. Beneficial insects. I know these aren't typically considered native to Iowa, but I really enjoy watching praying mantids as we go out into the field. So that's another aerial shot of the farm. Audrey, we can open it up to questions. I kind of wanted to end on a fuzzy note.
No, that's great. Andy, thank you so much. I think that, if it wasn't clear before, your presentation really sort of tied up with a beautiful bow how broad, how vast the public health topics that are covered in agriculture. So I really appreciate you bringing this kind of perspective in here. I also just wanted to say, referring to your and Paul and Dr. Winchester's systems thinking mentality, this is a quality that is preaching to the choir, right? This is a conference full of public health professionals. We've all been trained to really think upstream. We're systems thinkers, to notice all of these connections, and to know that we have this sort of, amazing opportunity, this intervention point at the farmscape level, at the landscape level, interacting with the land in a more gentle or productive way, really has all of these downstream positive impacts. And I just think that that's such a public health tenet, and I really appreciate all of you bringing that up in your various talks. So I wanted to maybe bring all three of you in while we are waiting for some participant questions. Feel free to throw those in the chat and we'll get to those. But I wanted to bring all three of you in with your perspectives or your reactions to each other's presentations, but also to raise the question of weed pressure, both pest pressure, both insects and weeds, the relationship between those, GMO crops, and the pesticide treadmill. This is a very, very broad topic, but I wanted to sort of shed some light on this relationship to folks who are not familiar with agriculture the way that you three are. So pesticide treadmill is the GMOs, and pesticide treadmill is the jumping off point for any of you who want to dip your toe in this scary water.
Okay, I'll give it a try. In the 20 years that I have been organic, I have had almost no real issues with insects. The only thing I've had was soybean aphids for a couple years, and there's genetic resistance to those now that's conventionally bred that I can use. So I have some insects out there, but I've never had a serious yield loss because of it. Now, certainly I have weeds sometimes, if it rains the whole month of June and I can't do a good job of cultivating, yeah, I'm going to have some weeds. That's one of the risks that we take as organic farmers. But by and large, it's worked pretty well. And now with all the herbicide resistance in weeds, I have neighbors that have more weeds than I do some years. So yeah,
Wow.
kind of works.
And just to clarify for some folks who may not know this, a GMO crop, or I guess I should say an organic crop, by definition is non-GMO.
Yes, I'm not allowed to plant a GMO crop. I'm not allowed to plant seeds that are treated with fungicides or insecticides, or I can't use any herbicides, insecticides, nematicides, any sides.
And I think what Paul has said is really accurate. When it comes to, like, if you're not really familiar with weed and pest pressure in a garden or in an agricultural field, the way to look at it is when you spray an insecticide, you're taking a shotgun approach and you're killing the rabbits and the foxes at the same time. And so when you do that the first time, you're like, hey, that seemed like it kind of worked. But the downside is you don't have any foxes left, and it might take them 3 to 5 years for them to recover. And so three months later, or in the insects, like with aphids, their life cycle is really rapid. It might be 21 days later, all of a sudden you have aphids again. And you say, well, shoot, I have to spray that pesticide again because I have aphids again. Well, you're bound to have that because the first time you sprayed, you wiped out all of the insects in your neighborhood that eat aphids. And there are a lot of insects that eat aphids. And so, if you have a rabbit problem, the solution isn't to kill all of the foxes, and that's kind of the GMO, herbicide resistant and insecticide resistant mentality. Buy the input and spray it. Well, you're wiping all of the things in the environment that can help you out. You're wiping them out at the same time that you're affecting your pest population.
That's such a good analogy.
That's really pesticide. That's what the pesticide treadmill is. Once you start on that treadmill, and weaning yourself off of that, once you've killed your soil with glyphosate, it might take you 3 to 5 years to even breathe enough life into your soil to build resilience back into your system. This is not a 1 year, you flip the switch and you go organic in a year. It might take you 3 to 5 to 7 years in order to be able to accomplish, what Paul has done over the last 20.
Right. Excellent points. Thank you, Andy. I have 2 questions here that I'm going to ask back to back, and I think that they'll be most relevant to you, Andy, but we'll definitely open it up to the rest of the panel for their input. And then I have a question for Dr. Winchester. From Shelley, do you feel like incentives like those used for corn and beans may help move more farmers to veggies? And then from Aaron, in regards to a wider systemic implications, are any of you working collaboratively to bring this knowledge or products to populations with less access to healthy foods? And she gives a really important Des Moines Whole Foods example there. And being a social worker, she does very rightly so make these connections for us. And they're very relevant to public health as well. So I'll have you start, Andy, and then if Paul, you want to weigh in, if the Pauls would like to weigh in, that'd be great.
Yeah, so those are both really good questions. And so our farm business, so in full disclosure, we scaled our operations back right before the pandemic hit, in part just because the wholesale market for fruits and vegetables in Iowa was in kind of a downward spiral. The institutions, the colleges, the universities, the hospitals, the nursing homes, all of the schools, the bigger purchasers, including grocery stores, really were not purchasing. And our farm was scaled such that we needed those institutions to buy from us. And so we scaled back. So the idea of food access, not everyone can shop at Whole Foods, and I totally get that. But one of the things that is nice is there are a lot of, you read about like misfit markets and some of these things where people are trying to, the less than spec, like maybe the foods that aren't pretty enough to put on the Whole Foods shelf are still good food. And so over the years, we collaborated on our farm with a number of different nonprofits. One of them was, it used to be called the Johnson County Crisis Center. And now they've rebranded, and I'm not sure I'll get the name right, but we would deliver wholesale quantities of food to the Johnson County Crisis Center every week of the year, and then they would distribute that to people in need. And so by doing the for-profit end of things well, it enables you to provide an awful lot of quality food to the people who need it. And so, there are a lot of not-for-profit groups out there trying to raise produce for people, but the volume of food that they're giving to food banks or food pantries pales in comparison to the amount of food that a farm our size was able to provide to even one entity like the Johnson County Crisis Center. And for incentives, I'll show somewhat of my libertarian streak here. I'm very wary of having USDA get involved because they're heavily involved in our corn soy alternation. And one of the reasons that Iowa's landscape is as messed up as it is because USDA is involved. As soon as we start to incentivize stuff, we'll have people that will take advantage of that. Would I rather incentivize broccoli over high fructose corn syrup? Yes, I would every single day of the week, even if it's conventional broccoli. So incentivize away if that's what we end up with. You go to France and a 2-liter bottle of soda costs about 4 times what a kilogram, which is 2.24 pounds or whatever, of organic broccoli costs. There's no reason that we should be incentivizing this cheap, terrible quality food in America.
The Johnson County Crisis Center is now known as Community, Andy.
Yeah, they were fantastic partners. Thank you, Pete.
There's a question for Dr. Winchester that I want to make sure that we touch on, and then I'm going to throw another question in the chat for our farmers to take a look at, because I just want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for your eyes to be on it before we wrap this up. We have about 5 minutes left. Dr. Winchester, this question's for you. Do you have any thoughts on how Iowans can address issues of pesticides in Iowa? Any specific sectors who need to be more active, like pediatricians, any other ideas?
Well, I guess I demur a little bit about the fact that my presentation always ends up with the response that Paul had, horrifying, bad. And I don't know, you're asking me where the good news is. And I'm kind of appealing to you. I learned a lot from Paul and Andy. And the first thing is, when you're doing what I do, you don't, unless you were a farmer, and I'm one of the few that in my department, I think, that was, you don't really realize the link between farming and us. And I think very few people would have recognized the statistics that Andy and Paul said, that that Iowa alone could be responsible for such a large percent of the I call them pollutants that are in the Mississippi River, but that all of us that are in farming have essentially polluted our pregnant mothers. Let's just start with that. And that the scale of this is so large that the question is, who do you see about that? If you're a pregnant mom with Roundup in you, who do you talk to? And I guess that's basically your question. And I've been looking to larger and larger organizations for the answer. You look at the EPA and you really can't go there because it changes every administration to becoming basically an agribusiness front company, and that doesn't help us. It hasn't helped us up to this point. I think to me the biggest important part is kind of what Dr. Andy Dunham was saying, that we have to increase awareness. Pregnant moms are at the moment of their life committed. From then on, they're committed. And they want to know, the first question is, what do I do? And I'd say eat organic. You could reduce the number of pesticides by a lot by doing that. So if we could increase the demand for healthy, clean food, a lot of this would change. Now, Andy, I don't know the answer to how you keep the capital free market out of it, because it just is there. But it is a really big question for me that I guess one of the things that's interesting about the pandemic, for those of you who follow the global warming conundrum, is that it took a catastrophe unrelated to global warming to show us what we could do in a single year by just stopping some of this nonsense. The CO2 reduction was greater than we could have hoped for in decades. So I would say eat organic, and ask your doctor, and ask your pharmacist, and ask your mayor, and ask your market to provide you evidence that these are safe foods to eat, not that they're free of chemicals. We don't have all the answers to all the chemicals for all the generations that they can cause harm to us. But we could just simply say, can I just have something that won't end up in my baby?
Mm. So there's a big awareness piece. So all of us sort of as knowledge holders of this, sort of maybe in our own public health capacities, can maybe be thinking about this and incorporating that into our practice. So we only have the 1 minute left. And so I think that I will so I think wrap us up and just thank you, all of you, again, deeply for being here and for being able to share your expertise. I will say this often in our Farming for Public Health work, but Andy, Paul, you are just as much public health professionals as Dr. Winchester and I purport myself to be. You are practicing these public health measures on the landscape level. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your work with us. If any of you have any questions or would like to follow up, please do send me an email. You can find more information about Farming for Public Health at farmingforpublichealth.org and about the CEEE at cEEE.uni.edu. My contact information is there, but thank you so much for all of your attention and for being here today.
I would like to add my thank you also. It's been an enormously elucidating presentation by all four of you, and raises questions that are important to be raised, but opens up, I think, a field that most of us who are not farmers probably haven't thought of and don't realize the impact of. I am struck by the parallel of the addition of subclinical doses of antibiotics to farm animals all the way from cattle to geese, and the deleterious effects it has had over the past at least 70 years. But it took us a long time to realize that. And we're acting on it, perhaps because the obvious effects are more apparent to people than those that have snuck up with pesticide use. But I hope that the end point of the knowledge of the effect of pesticides has the same effect on change in our world. Thank you all in the audience for attending. We have I believe, an hour break. There is a very interesting 2:30 presentation, which I would commend to you, and have a great rest of the day.